We have heard a great deal about the Mediterranean diet and how adherence to it is associated with a reduced risk of various diseases. Well, recently, another diet linked to geography has been making waves. We're talking about the traditional Atlantic diet, particular to the northern parts of Portugal and Spain. Like the Mediterranean countries, this region has a significantly lower incidence of heart disease than northern and eastern European countries. Interestingly, there are some significant differences with the Mediterranean diet, inasmuch as olive oil is not widely consumed, nuts and fruits are not prominent components of the diet, but red meat and pork are. The key components of the Atlantic diet are cod, other fish, red meat and pork, dairy products, legumes and vegetables, a type of vegetable soup they call caldo verde, potatoes, whole grain bread, and wine. To study the effects of this diet on heart disease, researchers in Porto, Portugal, carried out a case-controlled study. Patients admitted to a hospital after a heart attack were questioned in detail about their diets by trained interviewers, and the results were compared with randomly selected subjects from the same area who had no evidence of heart disease. For each food component, a median amount consumed by the control group was determined. Then, in the heart attack group, a score of 0 or 1 was assigned to each food based on whether its consumption was higher or lower than the median in controls. The results are interesting. The heart attack patients had a history of lower consumption of cod, dairy, legumes and vegetables, whole grain, bread, and wine. Unsurprisingly, they had a higher consumption of red meat, pork products, and potatoes. But surprisingly, fresh fish, other than cod, and vegetable soup showed no association with heart attacks. But how significant are these results? You know, in science, we clamor for numbers. When these are crunched, it turns out that adhering to the Atlantic diet can reduce the risk of heart disease by 33%. The results are even better if the inverse association with red meat, pork, and potatoes is taken into account. An intervention study has further bolstered the advantages of the Atlantic diet. In Porto, 250 families were randomized into an experimental and a control group. The experimental group was given cooking lessons, instructions about following the diet, and were supplied with necessary raw ingredients. The control families were told to just follow their usual eating pattern. Food intake was recorded in diaries, and after 6 months, waist circumference, triglycerides, high-density lipoprotein cholesterol, blood pressure, and fasting glucose were measured. These are the components that make up metabolic syndrome, an established risk factor for heart disease. Well, the incidence of metabolic syndrome turned out to be lower with greater adherence to the Atlantic diet. What is our takeaway here? Basically, we see some support for what we have learned from numerous other studies. Eating vegetables and whole grains is good, red meat, pork, and potatoes, not so much. Dairy and moderate intake of wine seem fine, but as we know, any possible benefit of wine for cardiovascular disease has to be balanced against the known carcinogenicity of alcohol. As for me, I'm not going to change anything about what I eat based on these studies of the Atlantic diet. And that for today is our Kappa Joe.